Thank you to everyone for coming and making time for this presentation, this Weave Along event. My name is Anna Rue. I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Upper Midwestern Cultures at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. We have a number of partners working together to bring this Weave Along event to you and this presentation. We'll be putting a number of links in the chat for you to follow up on. We encourage you to check out all of those different organizations. And also, if you are planning on sharing your weavings after this event, if you return to them and are moved to put a post up on social media, I'd encourage you to tag that image with SAS, S-A-S-S, Loom, L-O-O-M 2021. So go ahead and tag that photo and we can see all of your beautiful weavings from today. But without further ado, I would like to introduce our weaver for today, Lea Demuth of Decorah, Iowa. Laura has been a weaver for over 40 years and is involved with all aspects of textile production at her farm in just north of Decorah. And she's been raising sheep and taking part in all stages of the fiber arts, the fiber process. And she is also a seasoned instructor at Vesterheim in their folk art school, also located in Decorah, and has interests in spinning, dyeing, knitting, nålbinding, excuse me, and weaving. And she has been awarded the Vesterheim Gold Medal Award for her works as a weaver. Lea Lovelace is joining us from Vesterheim Museum as well, and we'll speak a little bit towards the end about further opportunities for folk art education at Vesterheim. Yes, and you see all of our sponsors and partners here on the screen as well. We'll start with a weaving demonstration, and we'll move on to, Laura will move on to a presentation of Norwegian coverlets using examples from Vesterheim's folk art collection. So Laura, I'll invite you to show us how to begin a weaving on these Hello Looms.
Well, thank you. And I'd like to start today by thanking you, Anna Rue, for inviting me to this presentation and also for introducing me to the Hello Loom. I had never seen one before, and they're quite ingenious. And so thank you for introducing those to me. I'd also like to thank Andrew Ellingsen, who works at Vesterheim, and he quite kindly put together this PowerPoint for me. And Lorraine Gilbertson from Vesterheim, she also assisted me in selecting the images that we'll see later of Norwegian coverlets. And of course, Lea Lovelace and Marcus, who are both handling the tech part of today. I am deeply grateful to you. So this afternoon, we have about an hour and a half together. And for the first part of our time together this afternoon, we are going to be weaving together on the Hello Looms. And during the second portion of today's presentation, we'll be exploring a variety of Norwegian coverlets from the Vesterheim textile collection. And so it's my hope that in the first part of the presentation today, you'll get a little bit of an experience of what it is to weave. You'll be introduced to at least a very simple weaving tool and some of the terms that weavers use in weaving. And then in the second part of this presentation, I hope you'll find it a real inspiration to see what people have done with weaving, and then particular to the Norwegian textile tradition. And when I was trying to create a piece for you to weave on your loom today while we're together, I was trying to find a way to have what you make on your loom be Nordic in character. So I was able to pick colors of wool that you will see in the coverlets and so on, and some of the images and techniques you will see in the coverlets as well. So we have about 25 to 30 minutes today to work together on the Hello looms, and then we'll move into the second portion. And in the part that when I'm talking about the techniques, I'm going to be giving you some tips and some techniques that you may not get to in the 25 minutes that we have together, but this is being recorded and you can come back and look at them later on. So it takes more than 25 minutes to weave a piece on the Hello loom. So don't expect to get your piece off in the time we are together, and please don't feel rushed that you have to be keeping up with what I'm talking about on screen. I mostly want you to have fun and get a little experience here today. So could you, next slide, please, Leah? So this is the Hello loom that you receive in your package. So I hope you all received it and you can take it out of its package. And the loom that you're receiving is going to have some different yarn selections than the one that's pictured here, but otherwise everything in your package should be the same. Next slide, thanks. So you need to take the bits of your loom apart. So if you gently press on the center section of your loom, you'll find that it just pops out. And then from the center section, you can pop out the needles and the comb. Next slide, please. So this is what your loom will look like. And those two parts on the side, they're wrapped with yarn. You can also kind of gently snap those free. So next slide. So when you're done, you should have 2 needles that what you'll be using to thread your wool black, red, white, and black yarns in. And next slide. And this will be used as a prop to hold up your loom if you want to use it to display your complete piece at the end. Okay, next slide. And that's a comb that we'll be using to push the weft yarn into place. Weavers call this a beater sometimes. And then this is the various pieces of your loom all taken apart. So it's my hope that you can have a bit of experience with the terms and materials of weaving, and that hopefully when you see other things in the collection, that you will be inspired to continue further explorations. And you can see here, I tried to create pieces that were somewhat Nordic in character. And I was also going to mention here that if you happen to have a pair of scissors handy, you might like to bring it close to your work. So next slide then. Okay. Now your kit contains 4 little butterflies of yarn, 2 white ones, 1 red one, and 1 black one. And the yarns are tied into little bundles, and those bundles are called butterflies. So what we're going to do is begin with the white yarn that's thinner and it's a little different texture than the other 2 yarns. And this yarn is your cotton warp yarn. So warp is the name that weavers give to the yarn that is the foundation of your weaving, and it's the yarn that is strung on your loom. So when you pick up your cotton butterfly, it'll have 2 ends, and if you pull on the ends, one of the ends you can pull the yarn freely from the bundle. So give that end a little tug, and then pull out a foot or so of yarn to begin with. And then the yarn should continue, hopefully, to pull easily from the butterfly, just as you need it. So then looking at the slide here, we're going to fasten your warp yarn onto the lower left-hand corner of your Hello loom. And you want to orient your Hello loom so that you see the words Hello loom written across the bottom, okay? So then leaving about a 1-inch tail you want to pass the yarn through the notch you see there in the lower left-hand side of the loom. And you want to pass the yarn going from the front of the loom toward the back. And then you want to bring the yarn in the back around that corner and then up through the first notch on the lower left-hand end of your loom. Okay, next slide. Then you want to keep your yarn, to keep your yarn from slipping. I'm sorry, could you back up one? I was one ahead of myself. Because this yarn is slippery and we want it to not, it can slip loose from that first round. What you want to do is wrap it around again a second time. So you want to pass it again through that notch on the lower left-hand side, and then the notch on the bottom. And by going around twice, that keeps your warp from slipping off the loom as you tie it on there. Okay, next slide. This is how you're going to start warping. So take your yarn from that bottom notch and take it up to the top of the loom and pass the yarn through the first left-hand notch at the top of the loom, around that little square peg, and then draw it down toward the bottom of your loom. Okay. Now you want to bring the yarn to the bottom of the loom and pass the yarn into the next open notch toward the left and around that peg, and then back up to the top of the loom, and just continue wrapping it from the top to the bottom in the next open peg. Okay, the next slide. So it's important as you're wrapping your warp yarn onto your loom to keep a firm and consistent tension on the warp yarn as you work across the loom. And this is going to allow you to create a successful weaving. So you want to continue bringing the warp yarn across the loom, from the top to the bottom, and around each consecutive peg until all of the notches have been used. And you'll have 12 threads strung across your loom when you're done. And your warp should be nice and tight as you wrap it, so that you could strum it. Okay, and there should be, when you strum it, you should notice that there's no sagging threads. And if you should notice that the thread is sagging, what you want to do is back up and snug it up so that it's nice and firm, and then just keep on your way warping. So when you've passed the yarn down into the final right-hand notch at the bottom of your loom, you're going to want to fasten it just as you did at the beginning. So next slide. Oops, can you back up one for me? Okay, so we're going to do the same at this end as we did at the beginning. To secure the end of your warp, you want to pass the warp yarn down into that final right-hand notch at the bottom of your loom, and then bring it up around the back of that corner and up through the notch on the right-hand side at the bottom of the loom down there. If you look in the lower right-hand corner of the photo, you'll see this. And then bring your yarn back down through that notch and up to the right-hand side, that little notch on the right-hand side a second time. And when you've gone around that corner 2 times, you can cut your warp yarn, giving yourself about an inch tail. So now your hello loom is warped and you're ready to start weaving. So we'll stay with this slide for a little bit. The yarn that we weave with is called the Weft yarn. And in this case, we're going to be using your wool yarn as the Weft yarn. And wool was the fiber that was traditionally used in Norwegian coverlets. That's why we asked for wool to be included in your kits. Now I'm going to suggest that everyone begin with their red yarn, just so that your weaving here at the beginning matches what you'll be seeing in the photos. I think that will be helpful. So what you want to do is, as you did before, find your red butterfly, pull on the end, that releases some yarn. And you want to cut off a piece that is about 12 to 18 inches long. And then you want to find one of your needles and thread that red yarn through the eye of the needle. Now, it doesn't really matter which side of your loom you start weaving on, but just in order for your work to match what you'll be seeing in the slides, I think it would be best if everyone started weaving on the right-hand side of the loom. So you want to bring the point of your needle over the first thread on the right-hand side, and then pass it under the second thread, over the third, under the fourth, and continue across the warp, alternating, passing the needle over one thread and under the next. And when you're all the way across, you should have picked up and have on the top of your needle 6 warp threads. Okay, next slide. So we're going to make the first pass with your weft yarn. So what you want to do is pull your needle and the yarn through across the warp, and you want to leave about 1 inch of yarn, a little tail, hanging out on that right side. You'll weave that in later, but right now we'll just let that hang out on the side. Okay, next slide. So now you want to take that little comb that came with your loom, and you want to push your weft yarn down to the very bottom of your loom, far down as you can get it to go. Okay, and the next slide. Now you're ready for your second pass. So now going from the left-hand side, pass your needle over the first warp yarn, warp thread there, and under the second, over the third, and so on across the whole warp. Continue alternating the threads as you pass over and under the warp threads. And you'll be picking up the opposite threads that you picked up on your first pass. So you want to pull your needle and your thread through your warp, but be careful not to pull in on the left-hand outer thread. Those outer threads, the one on the left-hand side and the one on the right-hand side, are called your salvage threads. And weavers fuss a lot about their salvage threads. What you ideally would like is to have those salvage threads always remain going straight from the bottom of your loom to the top of your loom and not be pulled in. It's really easy to pull in those outside threads. So when you bring your thread across and pull it, you want to snug it up against those outside warp threads, those salvage threads, but not tug it in, okay? And a second thing you want to do is to put an arc in your weft yarn. Okay, this allows for the weft yarn to do the work of going up and down between your warp threads. It's not actually going straight across. It actually has a lot of traveling to do. So that arc gives you just a little bit more length to your weft thread so that you don't pull in. So leaving an arc, next slide, take your comb and pack it down. Okay, next slide. So you're ready for the next pass, excuse me. So enter again on the right side. Pass your needle over the first thread, under the second, over the third, and so on across the warp. And you pull your weft yarn through the warp threads. Remember to pull the yarn so that it rests snugly against your outer warp thread, but it doesn't pull on this thread. This will give you a firm, straight selvage. And remember to leave an arc in your weft before beating it in place. And we'll stay with this slide. Actually, okay. This is the return of the second pass on your left-hand side. Enter on the left-hand side, place your needle over the first thread, under the second, and over the third. Again, snug it up against that outside warp thread. Give yourself an arc. Next slide. And then beat this into place.
Laura, can I ask how tightly people should be beating the yarn down?
Yes, that's a perfect question, because the kind of weaving that we're making today is called weft faced, and that means that only the weft yarns are going to show in a completed textile. So when you beat down, you want to beat down sufficiently hard that the warp yarn isn't showing through. Now, often you will find as you weave that the last 1 or 2 rows of your weaving, you'll pack it down and it'll bounce back just a little bit. And that's okay. As you add on subsequent rows, the previous rows will pack down sufficiently. So as you go on, you will notice that even if you see just a little bit of white dashes of warp yarn show up on the surface, as you keep packing in subsequent rows, they disappear. So in the end, we want a piece in which your white warp yarns don't show at all. That's a weft-faced piece. Okay, and there's something I wanted to show you, is that one of the ways that weavers often think about what threads to pick up is that if you look at the weft yarn in that last row that was woven there, you notice that the weft yarns create little hills over the threads they're going over, and then they go down behind the next thread and up and make a hill, and then we call that hills and valleys. So where it's passing over the warp thread, it creates a little hill. And then when it goes under a warp thread, it creates a valley. So if you're not sure what you should be picking up in a row, you can look at it and say, I pick up the hills. So you pick up the hills from the previous row. So if you look at this, I can't use maybe I can you see my mouse? Here's a hill and there's a valley, hill, valley, there you go. There's a hill and next is the valley. So if you just pick up the hill yarns, sometimes that's how weavers think of it, is you pick up the hills. That might be a helpful little tip for you. So in terms of pattern, the first thing I'd like to explore with you are horizontal stripes. So after you've woven some amount with the red that you like, Could be a ½ inch, could be something less than that. You might want to change colors, and changing colors is what will give you those horizontal stripes. So after weaving several rows of the red, you may wish to change them to your black yarn. So what you want to do is find your black butterfly and find the tail on your black butterfly that pulls easily, and cut off about 12 to 18-inch piece. And then you want to thread that through your second needle. So when you introduce a new color, you're going to do it the same way you did at the beginning with your red. You're going to go up and down. You can pick up your hill threads if that's a tip that makes sense for you. And you're going to leave a tail hang out about 1 inch long.
Laura, are we leaving the red yarn on the right-hand side, on the same side that we started when we start the black thread?
It really doesn't matter which side you end it on.
Okay.
That's just up to you. And just a little weaving tip. Sometimes what you don't want to do when you have to weave in your ends and the back is to have them all on one side of your weaving. So say you cut your red off on the right-hand side. When you leave a black tail to start your new thread, leave it hang out on the other side, the opposite side. And it's not a big deal if you don't do that, but sometimes not having all of your ends on one side of your weaving helps in the end when you work in those ends. And if the ends get in your way as you're weaving, they get caught in your threads, you can tuck them behind your weaving and they largely keep out of your way that way. So you can keep weaving with the second color for as long as it's pleasing to you. And keep packing it in. And as you see, when you keep packing it in, you no longer see any of your white warp threads. And the only thing it's showing is your weft threads, so that it's weft faced. And remember as before to snug your weft yarn up against the outside selvage threads. And then to give yourself a nice arc before you beat it into place. And now I'm going to go on and just talk you through some design possibilities. And I don't want you to worry about keeping up. I just would kind of like to plant some seeds in your thinking so that as you weave along, you could say, oh, I might try this or I might try that. But I don't want you to feel that you should be weaving really quickly and keeping up. But I wanted to show you a couple design possibilities. So here I've added the third color, the white. So just as before, I pulled a length off of the butterfly and threaded it through a needle. And again, you can leave a tail about 1 inch long hanging out of the side of your weaving. And in the example that I'm going to give you here, I'm going to be weaving narrow stripes. So when you weave narrow stripes, it's not necessary to cut your end every time you end a color and start a color. There's a way of bringing the unused color along the side with you. So in this case, I'm not using the black yarn. I'm weaving with the white yarn, but I'm going to return to using the black yarn very soon. So I want to carry the black yarn along with me. So what I'm going to do here is weave along with my white, just as I did before. But before I pass my white yarn all the way through and snug it up against the salvage thread, I'm going to leave a little loop in that white yarn and take the needle with my black yarn on it and bring it up through that loop. Okay, next slide, please. And then you see when I snug my white yarn up against that salvage thread, leaving an arc, I carry my black with me. So it's just tucked along with it. It's traveling along with me. And then I can beat that into place. Okay. And complete the pass. Okay, next slide. So now I'm ready to weave again with my black. And you see it's right there, right where I want it so I can weave. So I'm going to just weave as I've always been doing here, picking up alternate threads, come across, snug it up against that outside thread, leave an arc, and then pack that in. And I'll walk you through that how to carry it one more time here. So next slide. So before I bring my black thread all the way across, I'm going to leave a little loop over there. Okay, next slide. And then I'm going to pass my needle with the white on it up through that loop. So I catch it. Next slide. And then I'm going to pack it into place. And you see how that white yarn is just caught there. And that's just a little tip that can spare you some ends and just carry your unused yarn neatly along the side if you wish. If this seems like something that is more complicated than you wish to deal with, you can skip that too. But I think it does kind of give you a nicer salvage. Now, you may wish to continue weaving horizontal stripes until the very end of your piece. And many, many beautiful textiles are created with simply varying horizontal stripes. So please feel free, if you're having fun, to just continue doing this. Just as a technique, I'd also like to introduce you to what it is to weave vertical stripes. So a vertical stripe can be created simply by alternating colors. So here I've woven a little band. You can see the little band of, after I finished my black, white, black stripes, I created a red stripe. All right, then I started making vertical stripes in my weaving by introducing the white weft. And so what I do then is I weave one pass of white, followed by one pass of red, followed by one pass of white, and one pass of red. And then you see what that creates are vertical stripes. Okay. And these are you see vertical stripes used in quite a few Norwegian coverlets. They're called, not very kindly, they're called either old lady's teeth or old hag's teeth. And the reason for that is that pregnant and nursing women, it was said that they would lose a tooth per baby. And so the old hag's teeth or old lady's teeth was supposed to be a representation of what women's teeth look like after having several babies. But it is a pattern that is used quite often in the coverlets too. And now I'm just going to talk you through some things just to plant some seeds in your mind. You are not going to be weaving this fast, okay? But I just wanted to show you some possibilities. And some of these patterns you'll be seeing later also on the Norwegian coverlets. Okay, so here's just a combination of horizontal lines and vertical lines. And you can play around with these as you will. But if you look here, after I did my old lady's teeth, then I wove just a solid horizontal patch there of black. I have a black horizontal line, and then I alternated it with the red and the black. And the next slide. And then I just did several rows of just the red. And then I reintroduced the black. And you see, just by combining the vertical stripes with a horizontal stripe, and again with a vertical stripe, you're able to create crosses. So that's just to give you an idea of what you might create. And then before we finish up here, I want to talk a little bit about how you might want to present or finish your weaving. You may wish to leave your weaving on the Hello Loom and let the Hello Loom become something of a frame for your weaving. And in that case, you can take that centerpiece that you removed from your weaving at the very beginning, and there's a slot in the bottom of your Hello Loom, and that fits into that slot on the back so that your weaving can stand up sort of like a picture. So that's one option you have if you want to leave your piece on the loom. So the next slide. If you want to take your weaving off the loom when you're done, you can remove the warp threads by first turn your weaving around. So this is the back of your loom, and you can lift those, your warp threads off those little square pegs. You can just use your fingernail to do this. They lift off pretty easily. And then you can unwrap the corners there where you wrapped it on at the beginning. And then you can take it off, take it off on the top and the bottom of your loom. And the next slide, if you take your piece off, you will find you will have two ends. Remember those ends that you wrapped around the first and the last corner? Those two ends you will want to work back into your piece. And to do that, you're going to want to thread the warp yarn onto a needle. If you have what's called a tapestry needle, that's very handy, because the tapestry needle has a bigger eye that you can put your heavier warp yarn through, and it has a blunt point, unlike a sewing needle, it has a very sharp point. So you want to thread your warp yarn onto your needle, and the next slide. And then you want to take and with your needle and work it down through the edge, the selvage of your piece, so that it's secure. And then the next slide, you want to draw it through, and then you can just take your scissors and snip that flush with your weaving, and that will hold your weaving secure at the end. And you want to do that, of course, with the second thread you have there. So before we leave this section of our time together today, I just wanted to plant some seeds in your mind so that as you weave along, you can think about some other possibilities of ways you might want to weave. You can use a variety of horizontal patterning. You can use narrow and wide stripes. You can repeat them so they look like a border. You can add some vertical stripes, and you can play around with mixing the vertical stripes with the horizontal stripes and create other kinds of patterns. Next slide, please. Here's some other possibilities, just to give you some ideas you might want to play with as you weave along. And then
Laura,
here's a little piece. Yes.
Sorry, we have a question here about whether you are doing a plain weave for all of these color work designs. So in
Yes.
other words, you're doing over, under as the patterning. You're not doing like a basket weave where it's over 2, under 2.
No.
A plain
Good
weave.
question. Yeah, good question. This is all tabby. This is all plain weave. I meant to say that. Thank you for asking. This is all tabby. It doesn't require any special thread counting as you pick up your threads. Just always alternating your threads will produce these patterns. Yes. So I welcome you to keep weaving. If you're a kind of person who likes to work with your hands while you listen, I welcome you to keep weaving. And if not, you can set it aside and come back to it. And like say, there's a recording of this, so you can come back to your weaving and keep playing with patterns, however you like. So I'd like to move on now to talking about the Norwegian coverlets. And I felt that it wasn't quite right to just jump in and talk about the weaving first off, because a lot of work went into preparing the yarn and the fibers and so on before the weaver ever sat down to a loom. And so I'd like to talk really briefly about growing fibers, either plant, animals, or fiber, either plant or fiber, animal fibers. And they all required their own tools and their own skills. And to just jump over them as if a weaver just sat down to the loom with yarn in hand isn't quite fair, because quite often it was the same pair of hands that made the yarn and raised the animals and raised the fiber as it is, they were the same hands that did the weaving. So many, many skills went into getting ready to weave. And so I want to just briefly at least mention these. It is in no way doing justice to the skills involved in preparing for a weaving. And so I'm going to begin with a sheep. This is a picture of the old Norse sheep. And this is the breed of sheep that was native to Norway. And it's considered either a primitive or an unimproved breed of sheep. And there's several reasons for that. One is these animals shed their fleeces. They shed just like your dogs and your cats do. Modern breeds have been bred so that they don't shed, and modern breeds need to be sheared, and that's how we harvest their fleece. But the old breeds shed, and so that people did not gather their fleece all at once. They're also considered a primitive breed because they're double coated. And what that means is that their fleeces consisted of at least two different kinds of fiber. There was a soft undercoat and a longer, coarser overcoat of guard hair. And these different fiber types could either be spun together into one yarn, or they could be separated into the downy and the guard hair yarns. It all depended on what use was intended for the yarn. Next slide. And this is the Spelt sheep. And this is a direct descendant of the Old Norse breed. And it's a relatively small sheep compared to modern breeds. And it also is a double-coated fleece. And until about 1700, these were the only sheep in Norway. And they were well suited for the needs of the people who were living along the coasts of Norway or further inland. They were well suited to farming, and they were well suited to fishing communities. And then in 1700s, the British and the Spanish sheep breeds were imported, and then they were crossed with these native breeds. And then at the advent of commercially spun yarn, the dual coated fleece breeds dropped dramatically, because in commercial spinning processes, they want fleeces that are all one consistent kind of fleece. They don't want the dual coats. So as soon as we moved into the industrial age, the dual coated sheep breeds became rare sheep breeds. And today in Norway, there's still some Speltsow yarn spun, and a great deal of it is used in Norwegian coverlet weaving or tapestry weaving. So then I'd like to talk about next slide, another fiber that was very important in Norway, and that is linen. And this is a picture of a little flax patch that I grew in my garden last year. And linen comes from the flax plant. It's processed from the inner fibers of the stalk of the flax plant. And one of the lovely things about flax is that it always had these beautiful blue flowers. Flax is a short seasoned annual, so it grows very well in Norway. But to process flax is even more labor intensive than processing wool. It's a very long fiber, and it's a very strong fiber. And so it was often used as the warp yarns for the coverlets. It's also very smooth and it's very comfortable against the skin. So it was used for a lot of household textiles, such as tablecloths and bedding. And then really briefly about the tools for spinning. The first tools used for spinning were spindles. And fiber, either animal fiber or plant fiber, becomes yarn or thread when twist is added to it. That's the difference between fiber and yarn, is yarn has twist added to it. So the spindle was a device used by people to add twist to fiber. And the spinning process, when you used a spindle, had to be stopped after a certain length of fiber had been spun in order to wind it onto the spindle. You see those, the collection of yarn on a spindle is called a cob. So you see those little fat cobs wound around all the spindles. So each time you say spun a couple feet of yarn, you had to stop spinning and wind it onto your spindle and then start spinning again. And there are many different kinds of spindles, and they were developed for different kinds of fibers and for different purposes. And in terms of the length of human history, the drop spindle is by far the longest, has by far the longest history of any spinning tool. And then the next slide. And we're probably familiar with this device as the spinning wheel. And although to us now, this is considered to be an outdated tool, the spinning wheel is really rather modern, especially in Europe. And the origins of the spinning wheel aren't known. It was probably, we think, developed in India, and it reached Europe by the Middle Ages. And with a spinning wheel, the spinner adds twist to the fiber by treadling that bottom petal you see at the bottom of the wheel. And then spin is transferred into the yarn. And the spinning wheel has the advantage of allowing the spinner to wind the fiber onto a bobbin without having to stop the spinning process like you did with the drop spindles. And it's debatable whether a spinning wheel is actually faster than the fastest drop spindle spinners. I think it's generally considered to be faster, but I've heard arguments about that. And one disadvantage of the spinning wheel is that it's not portable. Women used to be able to walk and spin, and with a wheel, you could sit and spin, but you were sedentary and you had to remain indoors. So next slide. And I wanted to show you just an image here of a very old kind of Norwegian loom. Most of us, I think, when we imagine a loom, we imagine the big boxy floor looms. But this is the type of loom that was used throughout Norway until the 15th or earliest 16th century. And the tension on this loom is provided by the weight of very large rocks that you can see lined up at the bottom of the loom. Can you point to those, Lea? You see, yes, the rocks down there, they're big, heavy rocks. Okay, so they tied the warp yarn onto these rocks. So when you wound your warp onto your hello loom, you provided the tension by tying it on there tight. Well, what they did here was they let the warp hang, but they put a lot of weight on it to provide the tension so that they could weave. So with the warp weighted loom, the weaver had to stand to weave, and they wove from the top down. So if you can see the top of that loom, the weaver has already woven maybe 6 or 8 inches at the top of the loom there. And the weaving progresses from the top down on this kind of loom. And you needed to beat the yarn up while you're beating the yarn down on your hello loom. With the warp weighted loom, the weavers had to stand and beat the yarn upward. It was quite a feat to weave well on these looms. So that's all I'm going to talk about, which is very unfair in terms of all of the skills and the techniques people have developed over the years to create yarn and to weave on the warp weighted loom. But I'd like to go on and look now at some of the coverlets that are in the Vesterheim collection. And I'm going to begin with looking at coverlets that are like the weave that you're weaving on your Hello Loom. They're the weft-faced coverlets. And weft-faced means, of course, that only the weft is showing. And the weft-faced weaves provide very, very sturdy, very thick, very warm textiles so that they were ideal for coverlets. So the first kind of weft-faced coverlet I would like to talk about today is the rudavev. And rudavev means square weave, and it's a geometric tapestry technique. So we use the word tapestry when we're referring to a weave in which the weft yarn doesn't move from one selvage to the other. That's what you're doing on your Hello Loom right now, right? You're taking your weft yarn, you're going all the way across your warp. Okay, with tapestry techniques, you don't have one color of weft yarn going from selvage to selvage. You change your colors as you go across the warp. So it can employ many different wefts, and adjacent weft yarns need to be interlocked in some way so that there's a structure to the textile, and it holds together. So rudavev coverlets are often consist of a central pattern, as we see here, with borders at the top and the bottom, and sometimes there's borders on the sides as well. And as you see here, often on the Norwegian coverlets, the top and the bottom border didn't match. That didn't seem to be a value that they had, that there was a symmetry from the top and the bottom. Okay, the next slide. So what I'd like to do now, oh, this is a close-up here of the coverlet that we just saw. And I'd like to then go on and talk about different motifs that you often see in the rudavev coverlets. And this is an example of what's called the 8-pointed rose. And it's a universally popular motif throughout Scandinavia. And when it's used as a central motif, it's often placed within an octagon and arranged in rows. And on this sample, we can see the 8-pointed rose. If you count the red areas on this, those are the petals of the rose. And then in this particular one, in the center of the rose, you can see the cross motif. And you can see that the rose is surrounded by cross motifs as well. So the next slide. So this is another example of the 8-petal rose. Again, it has a cross in the center, and it's surrounded by crosses as well. And here is I just wanted to show you a variety of interpretations of the 8-petal rose. In the upper left-hand corner is one that includes something of a knot, a square in the center, plus a cross. And in the upper right-hand is an interpretation of the 8-petal rose, where the colors of the petals alternate between perhaps a light green and a red there, but they're not connected. So in that particular interpretation of the 8-petal rose, it almost seems to float against the background. And then it's framed in a diamond. And the lower left-hand corner, you see that the 8 petals have actually been joined up so that now that's 4 large petals. And again, there's a cross in the center, very typical. And this one is framed with an octagon. And then in the lower right-hand corner, you can see here they've alternated the colors of the petals of the rose. So it's like dark green, red as you go around. Again, a cross in the middle, and it's framed with an octagon. So you can see there's just a lot of different interpretations of a single motif. Okay, want to go to the next one. This is a cross motif, often seen in Rudevev coverlets. You can see here the central cross also ends, each of the arms of the cross ends in a cross. And there's a background cross made in red. There's a central cross. And the cross was actually a very, very common motif even before the time of Christianity in Norway. And another one, here's another interpretation of the cross motif. Here you see the background crosses were joined into a square. Again, there's a central cross in the blue cross. So there's many crosses worked into one motif. And this is again framed in an octagon. Okay, the next one. This is the knot motif. And the knot motif has been part of the Norwegian textile design since the time of the Vikings. And the knot was thought to have magical properties that could offer protection from evil powers. So it was powerful to wear or sleep under something with a knot motif on it. And the knot motif consists of a varying number of hollow squares that intersect at the corners. And the next slide. This is the lily and diamond motif. And in Europe, the lily was associated with the Virgin Mary. And it's found in Norwegian folk art since the Middle Ages. But it may have been earlier. We just don't have samples of it. And it often appears in a diagonal grid on the coverlets. And this one is surrounded by diamonds. And the diamond could either be used as it is here as an element to frame another motif, or diamonds could be used as a central motif in and of themselves. And then I would just like to look at just a couple Rudevev coverlets. Next slide. So that you can see how some of these motifs were put together into a coverlet. And this is a very typical kind of pattern. In the center there, you see the eight petal rose. And the zigzag on either side of that, that's a technique called lightning. And you often see lightning in conjunction with the square weave on Rudevevs. And then if you could see, I don't think you can probably see this on your computer screen, but if you could look at the top and bottom borders and those fine small borders in there, you would probably see some of the old lady's teeth that you're weaving perhaps now on your Hello looms. That was also a very common little small a design that was used in borders on the Rudevevs. The next slide. This is a very, very traditional looking Rudevev coverlet. 3 bands of diamonds, and here the diamonds are used as a motif in and of themselves. They're not just surrounding another motif. And then they have bands of crosses, and then some smaller motifs at the top and the bottom as borders. I like this piece because it clearly had seen a lot of wear as well as a lot of care. And I want to say that what we see as coverlets aren't quite what we think of as bedspreads these days. Coverlets were placed on the top of the bed, and they only covered the top of the bed. And Norwegian beds were much smaller than our beds. People did not necessarily lay flat, and people were smaller. So they were not nearly so wide as our modern bed, and they weren't the size of bedspreads. I wanted to include this piece. I think this is a really lovely, very lovely sample of a well-designed Rudevev. There's a lot going on it. You can see crosses, you can see diamonds. In the intersection of the diamonds, you can see the 8-petal rose. And on the top and the bottom of the coverlet, again, you can see the 8-petal rose motif. This is just a very splendidly done piece that I wanted to share with you today. Okay, now I'd like to go on to talk about a different kind of weft-faced coverlet. And this one's called Shielbrog. And Shielbrog means crooked pattern. And it's in reference to the zigzag designs that are typical in this technique. And the earliest samples of cookbrod surviving today in Scandinavia date from the 18th century. Cookbrod coverlets have at least 3 layers of wool in the weaving, so they were very warm. And you can see from this sample, it was woven on a narrow loom. 2 panels were woven on a narrow loom and then sewn together. That's true of many of the coverlets. They didn't have a loom that was wide enough to weave it as wide as they wanted, so they would weave it in panels and stitch them together. And the next slide. And this is a close-up of that cookbrod. And you can see where it gets its name, crooked pattern. It was woven on with at least 3 layers. And every time you added a layer or another set of harnesses, it became thicker. And you can have patterns here that include crosses and diamonds and X's. And a great variety was added to these by frequent color changes. So they're often really quite stunningly colorful. They're very, very attractive coverlets. And then now the last type of weft-faced weave I would like to talk about just briefly here is the tapestry. Tapestry is a form of pictorial weaving, and it dates at least from the Viking Age, which is about 1800 to 1066. And the majority of Norwegian tapestries involve biblical motifs. And the same motif could be repeated over and over and over again. And the parable of the wise and foolish virgins, which is what we see here, was the most popular motif found in Norwegian tapestries. And so looking at this tapestry, you see 2 rows of women. There's 5 women in each row, and they're all wearing bridal crowns. So we know that they're preparing for their wedding. And the top row is a depiction of the wise virgins, and they're holding their lanterns aloft, and they're lit because they are ready and waiting for Christ. And the figure on the very right-hand side, left-hand side of that top row, that's the Christ figure. So it's Christ with the 5 wise virgins with their lit lanterns. And then on the bottom row, you see the foolish virgins. And their lanterns are not lit, and they're holding their handkerchiefs to their eyes because they're crying. They did not keep their lanterns lit, and so they were not prepared for the coming of Christ. And then the figure there in the lower right-hand corner is the oil seller. This was very, very, very popular image, repeated over and over in many Norwegian tapestries. So the next slide. And this is a close-up of that Norwegian tapestry. And this is very, very typical of what the cartoons look like, what the characters look like in Norwegian tapestries. It was a 2-dimensional style. There's no shading in the tapestry to indicate any kind of volume. There's no foreground exactly and no background exactly. It's just all flat. And even any bit of empty space is generally filled with some kind of a pattern. And this was typical of the Norwegian tapestries. So I'm going to leave the weft-faced weaves and go on to a group of weaves called the balanced weaves. And they differ from the weft-faced weaves that we've been talking about in that both the warp threads and the weft threads appear, they're visible on the surface of the textile. And the samples that we are going to see are a large body of weavings in the overshot group, for those of you who are weavers. And the first one I want to look at is the monk spelt. And here's 2 panels of monk spelt. I don't know if these were intended to be sewn together as a coverlet. They obviously differ in length, but the patterns are roughly the same. It takes a good deal of skill in weaving 2 panels to get them to come out to be exactly the same length. So that can be a challenge for a weaver. And in these kinds of weaves, the white that you see there, that is probably linen. It was the warp. It's also used as part of the weft, and all of the color work you see there is wool. It's a wool weft yarn. And the next slide will be a close-up of this. And you can see that the monk's belt has pretty much two choices. You've got two areas of blocks, and they alternate back and forth. And the weaver could decide to change how long to make those blocks, like in the dark, those two dark sections that are kind of like a border. You see they switched very quickly from one block to the next, whereas where you have a larger motif, they expanded those blocks and used brighter colors. So that by changing the size, how many times you repeated a block, and by changing the color combinations, they could create a wide variety of patterns, even though the weaving technique only allows you to have two different choices of blocks. So the next one, this is a telemark's teppe, and that means telemark's weave or telemark's coverlet. And this is from the Telemark area of Norway. And this structure requires 3 blocks. You have 3 block patterns to choose from. And telemark's teppe is distinguished by these horizontal bands of oval patterns, which you can elongate the patterns or shorten the patterns to create quite a bit of a diverse looking textile. And again, color changes play a large part in the design. And this sample includes a central square, you see, woven there using only red in the center. And it has the 4 corners of that square are highlighted with just the white diamonds. So let's look at the next slide as a close-up of this. Here you can see there's the white diamond at the corner of the square, and you can see where that corner of the square there is only red yarn used. And that oval that you see, the ovals are very characteristic of telemark's teppe. There are variations of the oval used over and over, but the variations give you a large variety of patterns to choose from. And then you can see how the color choices and the frequent color changes are typical of the telemark's teppe tradition. And here again, what you're seeing is a cotton or linen warp and a wool weft. And then the last of the balanced weaves that I'd like to look at today is called Shielbrog. And Shielbrog is a specialty weaving, actually. To weave this on a loom, a floor loom, required a special floor loom that had 2 sets of harnesses. And a close-up of this one, next. You can see here, again, frequent color changes were important in creating the pattern. The white that you see there is either a very fine linen or a cotton that was used as the warp. And the weft yarn was a combination of the cotton or linen and the wool weft, pattern. And then, just sort of because I couldn't quite help myself, I wanted to include a couple specialty weaves that are close to my heart, and they have very fine samples of these at Vesterheim. So the first one I'd like to share with you is the double weave pickup. And these are really specialty weaves. Not every farm household wove these. These could often be people who were professional weavers. And the double weave coverlets are woven from 2 layers of warp, one a lighter color and the other a darker color, often the darker color providing the background and the lighter color the patterning. The oldest known samples of the double weave in Norway were actually church textiles. And it's not clear when the double weave moved from being a church textile to actually being used as a coverlet. And you can see on this sample, there's actually multiple borders. You want to flip back for just a second, Lea? You can see there's multiple borders. There's an outside border, and then there's a very thick inner border before you get to that central motif. And then on the right-hand side, if you look just inside that outer border, if you look really closely, that's exactly right, Lea. along there, you can see letters and numbers. And one of the things that double weave pickup allowed the weaver to do was to put their name and sometimes the date in which they wove the piece. So that's always really fun to see, you know, so who wove it and how old the piece is. So the next slide. And here's a close-up of that. Here you can see that the background layer was they alternated between a reddish color and brown. And then the patterning layer was the yellow. And then on the left-hand side, you can see that there was a star motif, the diamond motif, kind of with crosses too. And then the center there, you see the kind of fern-like pattern with the diamond in the center. That was considered grapes and leaves. That was very popular with the double weave pickup as a motif. And then on the right-hand side, you see what's called the double hearts. That was also a very, very popular motif used in double weave pickup. And then on the center of that, you can see again, the 8 pointed rows. So variations and themes we've seen before. Okay, and this is the last one I want to show you. This is called the Lea. And these made for especially warm coverlets. One side of the Lea is flat woven surface, and the other side is a pile. So this is one side of this textile. And can you show me the next one then, Lea? And this is the back of this textile. And these were woven to mimic sheep fleeces. So you can see sheep skins. So they'd be flat like the skin side of a sheepskin, and then the pile side, which would be the fleece side. And for fishermen going out on the ocean, taking an actual skin with you to use for your bedding at night wasn't that helpful, because the salt air, the salt spray from the ocean would actually harden the skin side of a skin so that it was just like a board. And so it'd be sleeping under a board, which wasn't very warm. So these were created, the Lea was created as kind of a way of mimicking a sheepskin. So one side is flat and the other side is pile. So the next slide, please. So this is a close-up of that same weaving. This is the woven side. It's a diamond twill. It's a balanced weave. And in this case, there's lots of stripes going on in the weaving structure and the warp and the weft. And in this case, the knots were tied in such a way that you actually tie the knots into the weave as you weave. But if you're very careful, you can tie the knots in such a way that they don't show on the flat side of the textile. You can also choose to have them show, but this weaver chose to not have them show. And then the next is a close-up of the back of the weaving. And you can see here that the weaver chose to use a variety of yarns. This is perhaps yarn that she had left over from various other projects, and they provide the pile on the weave. And so when you sleep under one of these, you actually have the pile against you, and that's to keep, it provides an extra layer of insulation. So these were very warm. And so this is the last that I would like to share with you today. So I hope our time together today, this afternoon, has given you a little sample of the weaving process. And I hope also that seeing all these samples from the Vesterheim collection has given you some inspiration for what's possible, and perhaps to come see the collection at some time. So at this point, I think Lea.
Thank you, Laura. Every time Laura does a program for us or teaches a class, I feel like I've just been nourished with the most wonderful meal. My brain has been nourished. So thank you. I'm sure other people are feeling that way today. My name is Lea Lovelace. I'm the Director of Folk Art Education at Vesterheim Norwegian American Museum and Folk Art School. And I just have the privilege to be part of this today. Vesterheim is so excited to be partnering with Marcus and Anna and being part of SAS and getting a chance to share with you a little bit of our wonderful collection of 33,000 objects that is one of the wonderful things when you come to Vesterheim Folk Art School for a class. You get like this, special ticket behind the scenes, and you get to see some of these wonderful things. So here's like a little bit of a sneak peek of what it looks like when Vesterheim is open for in-person things, right? Lots of gathering in small spaces, not exactly pandemic friendly, but it's about community and it's about our collection. That's what I think sets us aside from other peer institutions, is that you get a chance to learn from the objects, and also connect with other people who, whether they're makers or they're people working to mastery in their craft. It's a fun environment. During the pandemic, like many others, we decided to be creative, and so we had wonderful instructors who were willing to pivot with us and learn along the way, and we had wonderful participants who were willing to help us pilot and prototype and try new things. So we went from an average year at Vesterheim of hosting about 600 to 700 people in about 70 on-site classes to, in this last year, starting in July, offering, I think it's 167 classes now. Before this last quarter, we're about to start, and we've served almost 4,000 people. That means that we've had engaged with 6.5 times the number of people in this last year from 49 states and 15 different countries. And that really makes our hearts happy, because that's the positive to a lot of missed opportunities and changes in the way that we live and work and experience and connect with others. So during these classes, it's a great opportunity to learn new things, right? A lot of these classes, it's not the same as taking an in-person 5-day rose mauling class, but it's a chance to connect with community. It's a chance to learn new skills, and it's a chance to sample something new. And it's also a chance to connect with our collection. So the classes are one way. Another way is through these amazing programs where we have people who have a wealth of knowledge about different folk art disciplines or folk art, experiences, to speak with the public and connect to actual works in our collection. So Laura has hosted one of these lunchtime collection connections. It's now up on our YouTube channel. Other weavers like Robbie LaFleur and Jan Mostrom have done it. Also, we've had, fiddle makers and all kinds of other people. It's a way to uplift the folk art instructor community at a time when they can't come to Vesterheim to teach classes, but it's been so successful, we're doing it even after we open in September. So another thing is we've really tried to connect with families during this time, and we've been just overwhelmed by the number of families who have joined us on different kinds of programs. And there's Anna and her daughter. Sorry, Anna, I didn't ask you if it was okay to use this. One of the ways that we also try to include cards that have different amazing photos of pieces from our collection that connect with the theme. So if it's a book adventure, we'll select images of things in our collection that connect to that theme. If it's a handcrafted home experience where you're trying something like coal rosing or weaving on the Hello Loom with Laura later to come in a few months later, then we try to connect with people to see things in our collection even though they can't come to Vesterheim. And then lastly, this program is our contemporary folk art webinars have been really delightful. They're free programs that using the Zoom format like this today. And it's a way to include, uplift some voices that are contemporary folk art artists and have them maybe look at things in our collection and then talk about how that is inspired where they are today in their traditions. This image here comes from a program we had actually last weekend with Siri Briford, who is a contemporary jewelry artist and fashion artist in Norway. And she used things from our collection and things that she had seen herself in Hardanger and other places to talk about her own contemporary practice. And these go up on our YouTube channel too. So we have virtual galleries you can look at. And we also have, as I mentioned, the YouTube channel, which shows programs that we've had in the past, like these collection connections and like these contemporary lecture style webinars. And so we hope that you might find something worth checking into. And yeah, I'm going to pass it back to Anna now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lea and Laura, for that excellent presentation. We've been getting a lot of positive feedback in the chat, and we've had some questions come in too. So we do have just a few minutes left, but I thought I would throw a couple of those questions your way, Laura. They seem to be weaving related here. So let's just throw a couple out there to you before we have to sort of wrap up here. And we had one question about whether the Rutevev patterns are charted or worked on using a cartoon at all, or how are those patterns created in the Rutevev tradition?
They are charted before you warp your loom, because you need to determine how many warp threads you need. So it's often the case that a square will be based on 4 threads. So I use graph paper. I love graph paper. I think most weavers do love graph paper. In fact, I don't know how people wove before there was graph paper. But you graph it out on graph paper, and then you determine how many threads per block you're going to have, and then multiply that. Say it's 4, you multiply that by 4, but you have to have that all figured out before you warp your loom. So yeah, you have to go from at least I never wing it. I guess maybe there are people who wing it, but I don't. And they're very geometric for the most part. So you really need to have them symmetrical for the most part. So yeah, you do plot that out beforehand.
Okay. Yeah. And we have another question about the telemarksteppe and whether the red center was created by using a clasp weave technique, and I'm not sure what that is, but clearly we've got experienced weaver asking this question.
So they say, what was the term used?
It says, with the telemarksteppe, was the red center created by using a clasp weave technique?
How I would describe that is that it was using discontinuous wefts, which is a little bit like a tapestry technique added to an overshot. But what you do is, all right, say you were having green on the outside with that red square in the center. When you have your weft, you take your green over as far as you want to have be the border for your square. You put it down, you pick up the red, and you go across the width of the square, put that weft down, pick up another green, and go to the other selvage. Does that make sense? It's a discontinuous weft. So you would actually have 3 weft threads going across there. And they were often also woven upside down, which adds a little bit of fun to the process. But it's a discontinuous weft. So that the person who wove that was a really skilled weaver.
Okay. And we do have one other question about using sheep fleeces to line weavings, and whether that was done on one side of a coverlet. Would fleece be added to that?
Fleece was off. There's a weaving technique called varfel, where the fleece was used instead of yarn. My understanding, and I have a limited understanding of this, is that they were often used for coats. I don't know how much they were used for bedding, like the coverlet, but the things I've seen that used for, and I've done that. I have some question about matting over time with the fleece as opposed to the yarn.
So the yarn with like the raya would not mat as much as.
Yeah, that would be my concern, is that it would mat.
Okay.
So they probably did it as coats as well. And that can add, I mean, that isn't necessarily a horrible thing, because that is also dense and keeps you warm. So
yeah. Well, let's see. Oh, and we did have a question about dyes, whether dyes were always used, or whether they were natural dyes or manufactured dyes at any point. And when would a manufactured dye have been introduced, if you have, approximate timelines
Right.
for that?
So if a coverlet dates certainly before the 1860s, it was naturally dyed, because that's when commercial synthetic dyes became available. But probably in areas of Norway, particularly the remote areas of Norway, the chemical dyes didn't become available until much later. So before that, everything was naturally dyed. The coverlets often would include white and black, and the white could be the natural color of the fleece, of course, and so could the black. So sometimes they didn't require, they could get colors just from the fleeces themselves. But otherwise, they did a lot of natural dyeing. Natural dyeing doesn't leave artifacts. It's kind of one of those things we ignore because it's just big pots, and it's cooking stuff. And those things we don't really identify necessarily as we do a drop spindle or a spinning wheel. But they did have quite a variety of plants that they used in Norway, things like club moss, lichens, woad for blue. So there were quite a few things that they had in Norway to use for dyeing. And there was also a trade in dye materials as well. So, but that added a whole other layer of expertise to have the natural dyes involved.
And the coverlets and the tapestry weavings you showed were, you're just blown away by the color work in all of those pieces. Would the variation of colors and the varieties of colors used be an indication of skill of the artist, or maybe relate more to the dyeing plants and vegetation available to work with those colors, or what would that indicate of large variation of colors in a weaving?
I think wealth and time, for one thing. I don't think that just your average farm home was able to create a lot of those. And even the Rias, because they had the woven side and the pile side, that is an enormous amount of wool, which means an enormous amount of labor. And so the Ria used to be displayed in the house as an emblem of wealth, because that meant that you had enough labor in your home to produce that kind of textile. So if that's true of the Ria, think about the tapestry, because the tapestry is so slow and labor intensive. And it also involves a kind of creativity to imagine the figures and plan that out. So I think that is an indication of wealth, and probably if they have a lot of really bright colors, that would certainly indicate that they were using commercial dyed yarns.
Well, thank you so much for lending your expertise today. I'm noticing that we are right at 3:31 at this point. So we've managed to hit all of the questions in the Q&A, but I do want to just say thank you again to Laura and Lea for joining us today and presenting such a wonderful program and demonstrating how museum's collection can help feed the production of these of handcrafts and keep these traditions moving forward in new and creative ways. And thanks to everybody who came and messed around on their Hello Looms. This is also a sort of a new or possibly new to some folks in terms of the scale that they're used to weaving on if you're an experienced weaver. But we also had first-time weavers with us here today, and we hope that this is a little taste of some techniques that you can employ at home, whether you're experienced or not, and that you can have fun creating a little a weaving for yourself that you can display with pride and even share with us. later when you've gotten to a point where it's finished. But we will be sharing out all of the links that we've been sharing in the chat. We'll put together some vocabulary terms for people to return to, and a link to this recording, which we'll end up posting at the Center for the Study of Upper Midwestern Cultures YouTube channel in the coming days. So anyone who's registered for this event will get a follow-up email with a lot of resources for you to continue exploring your weaving practice, whether that's been going on for decades or whether it's begun with us here today. But thanks everybody for being involved and helping us organize this event, and we hope that everyone's had an enjoyable time this afternoon.